Hi students, today we are in Unit 3, Notes 2, Life and Slavery. You'll need a pencil and a highlighter to complete your notes. Please turn your notes packet to page 5 at this time. In order to understand slavery in the United States, we have to go back and look at the slave trade and how it got to the United States to start with. Slavery had been a part of most societies since the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The African slave trade began with the Portuguese in 1526, and other European countries were soon to follow. By the 1700s, the British, French, Spanish, and Dutch empires were all involved in the triangular trade. This trade route exchanged European goods for African workers who were shipped to the Americas and traded for raw materials to be shipped back to Europe to be made into finished goods. And then it goes back to Africa to trade for the slaves. The slaves went across to the Americas to harvest the natural resources and work the plantations, and then back to Europe to make those goods into finished goods, the raw materials into finished goods, and then back and so forth. This is the triangular trade route right here. So you got things like rum and sugar and such that go to Europe. Firearms, cloth, and salt and such go to West Africa, and slaves over to the Americas. So, two important vocabulary words that we have here. We first have the slave trade, which is the business of capturing, transporting, and selling people as slaves. Business of selling people as slaves, slave trade. The second important vocabulary term is triangular trade. And triangular trade is like I just showed you in the picture. It is trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. The southern colonies imported slaves using the Atlantic slave trade to provide laborers for plantation crops such as tobacco, indigo, rice, and cotton. Indigo is what dyes your denim blue jeans blue. While some of our country's founding fathers objected to slavery, others, including Thomas Jefferson, had owned slaves. There were a number of debates over slavery when the Constitution was written. The Southern states would not ratify the Constitution if it was going to threaten their economic and cultural structure. So the South relied on slavery for how they made money and how life was set up in the South. But the irony here is that Thomas Jefferson, in creating this Constitution, they wrote the lines, "We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal." But he was a slave owner and he had a plantation with about 600 slaves. Not really speaking his truth there when he said all men are created equal. The Constitution allowed Congress to revisit the issue of slavery 20 years after the Constitution was signed. In 1807, when Thomas Jefferson was president, Congress banned the Atlantic slave trade that brought slaves from Africa. However, smuggling was common and buying and selling slaves in the U.S. was still legal in nearly half the states. So in your notes packet where it says slave trade, kind of a little timeline of the slave trade was that the 1600s, Britain, Spain, and Portugal brought African slaves to the Americas. In the 1700s, the southern colonies started relying on slave labor. And in the 1800s, foreign slave trade was banned, in the US. But just because it was banned didn't mean that it didn't happen. Buying and selling slaves was still legal in nearly half the states.
report for Mrs. Baxter. Why? Dear Tim and Moby, I want to know about the history of slavery in America. From Dwight. Unfortunately, slavery's history goes back to way before the United States even existed. Early records show that people were enslaved thousands of years ago in places like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. Even the ancient Greeks, the inventors of democracy, used enslaved people as household servants. But in the Americas, slavery was particularly brutal. Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors enslaved the native people who lived in Mexico and South America. Oh, conquistador means conqueror in Spanish. The British and Spanish colonists in North America enslaved native people there, too. But in the British colonies on the East Coast, they quickly shifted to enslaving people from Africa. Beginning in the early 1600s, Africans were used for household help and farm work in North America. And the southern colonies built their whole economy around a slave workforce. They labored growing cotton, indigo, and sugar on large farms called plantations, while northern colonies became more industrial, so they needed far fewer workers. By the end of the 18th century, the African slave trade had stolen millions of people and shipped them to North America. The slave trade was a big international business. In Africa, people were kidnapped and traded to merchants in exchange for European goods. They were then sent to the Americas, where they were forced to work on plantations. The crops they grew were sent back to Europe, where they were sold and manufactured into goods. The system was called the triangular trade, and the leg between Africa and the Americas is known as the Middle Passage. People were chained together and packed like livestock into cargo holds. They often couldn't move at all, not even to go to the bathroom. Many got sick and died. Others tried to starve themselves or jump overboard to escape. Over 15% of the captives perished while on board. For those who survived, the excruciating journey took months. The first stop was the West Indies, islands in the Caribbean. Some enslaved people were kept there as plantation workers. Others were sent to America, where they were sold at auctions. Families were broken up and sold to different planters. Well, back then, many Americans thought that Africans were inferior people. They were judged because their skin was a different color and because they weren't Christians. Greed was a factor, too. Free labor made a lot of people very rich. Enslaved workers had no rights at all. Plantation owners could make them work all day without rest, beat them, and even kill them. It was all legal. You said it. But eventually, things did begin to change. In 1808, bringing slaves over from Africa was outlawed. Of course, there were millions of Africans here already, and laws had been passed to make slavery hereditary. That meant any children of enslaved people were enslaved too. So the system actually expanded as generations of children were born into slavery. But by the 1850s, most northern states had outlawed the practice. In 1860, the U.S. fought a civil war over slavery, which brought it to an end. During the war, Abraham Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation. He declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states were now free. And the 13th Amendment to the Constitution officially outlawed slavery in 1865. But the effects of slavery didn't end overnight. African Americans were treated as second-class citizens for the next 100 years. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s made huge strides toward righting those injustices. Since then, we've made a lot of progress, though we still have a way to go. It's up to all of us to work toward a society that treats people fairly, no matter our race or background. We're all just people, you know? You're people too, as far as I'm concerned.
The second part of the notes talks about the economics of slavery. So, how does slavery help the South make money? The cotton gin had made growing cotton more profitable. In 1790, the South produced 3,000 bales of cotton. Because of the cotton gin, which we learned was invented by Eli Whitney, the Cotton Kingdom expanded through the South, and by 1850, cotton production had increased to 4 million bales a year. So 3,000 to 4 million, that's a huge increase in the amount of cotton being made. And then that cotton could be sold to countries, say in Europe, or even up into the north, where they go to factories to be made into fabrics. As cotton brought more wealth to the South, the value of slaves increased. The more money made from cotton and the more valuable slaves became, the more resistant slave owners were to the idea of ending slavery. And you can see on that map there, you can see that the free states are in yellow and the slave states are in purple there. And where corn is grown, cotton, rice, tobacco, and wheat. Only wealthy planters were wealthy enough to afford to buy slaves. The majority of white Southerners were too poor to be slave owners. But all Southerners knew that the economy and social structure of the entire South relied on slavery. In their eyes, freeing their slaves could only lead to complete financial ruin for the South. Okay, so in the economics of slavery box, only a small percent of Southerners could afford to buy slaves. The South's entire economy relied on growing cotton. Ending slavery would ruin the economy. Again, that word economy is basically how an area makes money. Free blacks in the North. Northern states had banned slavery, and 8% of blacks in the United States lived in northern free states. Their lives were much freer than blacks living in the southern slave states. However, northern blacks were not treated equally to whites. Blacks struggled to find high paying jobs. Often, communities remained segregated or divided by color. Blacks were not usually made to feel welcome in white schools and churches. So, free blacks in the North. Northern states banned slavery, which was a good thing, but they still faced unequal treatment. They had trouble finding good paying jobs, and they had separate schools and churches for black people. About half of all free African Americans lived in the South, working as laborers, household servants, or craftsmen in towns and cities. Many white Southerners viewed free blacks as dangerous. They feared that free blacks would make enslaved blacks discontent or unhappy with slavery. Strict laws forbid free blacks from owning guns, traveling without documentation, or working certain jobs. So there were free blacks in the South. They mostly worked as laborers or servants in town. But whites were afraid of that free blacks would make their slaves unhappy. Okay, this concludes your notes for Life and Slavery Notes 2.